Okay. If you haven't already, I'd encourage you to go ahead and print off the graphic organizer for this chapter so you can fill it out as we're going along. This chapter is about theory and language acquisition models. So, people trying to answer how language is formed, what comes first, which parts of language do we learn first. It's kind of down in the mud, for lack of a better expression. I just encourage you to try really hard to stay focused and try and draw something that you can use in practice even as a teacher. I know you're not linguists. I know you're not studying to specialize in language, but there is still developmental, I guess I want to say, theories and truths that you need to know, these foundational thoughts and ideas about just human growth and development as it relates to language. Because I firmly believe that those teachers that have an adequate grasp of human growth and development, including in the area of language, that just makes you a better teacher. It helps you kind of differentiate a problem versus just a developmental delay. Anyway, hang with me. It's kind of interesting, I think, but I just don't want you to check out. And I know this is not necessarily the most maybe exciting thing to study for everyone. So, some goals, they want you to be able to explain the behavioral model versus the nativist model versus semantic and or excuse me, not versus, but explain how semantic knowledge makes a difference, meaning vocabulary, explaining how social interaction, pragmatics makes a difference in language development or acquisition. The other models would be there's several contemporary models that we're going to, just briefly hit on. And at the very bottom, kind of what I was trying to get at, explain the implications of language acquisition, language development models for the teaching of language. And even though you might not explicitly be teaching language, you're going to use language to teach. And so we need to know these things. It's not going to hurt us, that's for sure. Here's some key terms to come back and refer to. All right. This is what we're going to look at. We want to know that if we're going to actually consider a language acquisition theory, that they've at least addressed a few things specifically. So these authors suggested looking at what is present when their learning begins, meaning what does the child bring to the task? What do they already have? What mechanisms are used during acquisition? Meaning, does it use general development of cognitive skills, or are there mechanics mechanisms specific to language that are used? What type of input drive is the language learning system? Or what type of input drives, the language learning system forward, which makes it work? So they're asking, how and when do they use the language they're learning? Because when you're teaching a child to talk, as soon as they kind of learn that their communication gets them something, that speaking language gets them something, a lot takes off from there. It's very highly reinforcing and motivating. And then lastly, how is it that children from all different types of social backgrounds, from all types of environments all over the world, learn language in approximately the same way? So that developmental sequence wise, we kind of all learn whatever language we're learning in the same way. So when you're looking at a model of language and you already know what's true, you have to compare that theory against some other things that we know to be true. Because as we start looking at these, and here's that graphic organizer I mentioned, as we start looking at these, there really are, how do I want to say, descriptions and then possible limitations and implications, meaning what should we do with it. And so there has not been a language model researched to date that can state implicitly that it is the one and only correct language model. All that to say, we don't absolutely know for sure. And I think as we go over what it suggests, and I'm also going to tell you its limitations, that will make more sense, because if we know certain things to be true, each model kind of has an Achilles heel where we can't explain it to an extent. So we're going to start with the behavioral model. This is very common. It's becoming more common. If you've heard of ABA therapy, that's a highly recommended and insured, accepted by insurance companies form of therapy for children with autism. And so that's a large population these days. So ABA, behavior analysis, leans towards this model of teaching, of language acquisition, and also how to teach language. Overall, the child, as in this kind of model, a child is seen as relatively passive and just the recipient of their external influences, meaning it's just a behavior that's trained. And so it's not as critical in this theory what they bring to the table beforehand, maybe in their IQ or previous exposure or any of those things. They're saying that the language is developed as a direct result of imitations being produced, so a child talking and then instantly meeting reinforcement of some kind. And that's how we learn talk, that's how language is formed, and that's how we should teach language. So if we talk about imitation, the child begins to model sounds of individuals they are frequently exposed to, meaning they start repeating usually what their caregivers are saying. And then they meet a reinforcement, a consequence. So consequence does not have to be negative, it's just the result. So individuals respond by reinforcing, punishing, or ignoring. I'll give you an example. A child, my baby Sam, says, "Milk, mommy," and I give him milk. He gets what he asked for, so he's reinforced. Versus if he's screaming no and I ignore him because I don't want him to scream no and as a way of communicating that thought to me, then he might decrease the behavior because I've ignored it. But either way, a result of what he's saying is coming from how it's reinforced. And there's a lot of truth to this. The child begins to string together verbal behaviors to make an utterance through prompting, meaning if they're asked, "What do you want?" or if they know that there's some responsibility on them and that you're going to prompt them to communicate before they meet any kind of reinforcement, then they're just going to start doing it. Some limitations in this area, and to be honest, this is not a language acquisition model that I have studied in depth, and so I'm careful, but according to what I do know and even what your text presents, some limitations would be this idea that children often don't have great grammar in the beginning, but we don't always correct it. So, for instance, my little guy, I have a 4-year-old. He'll always tell me his feet are cold, and I know he means his feet are cold, and he's just using a grammar rule on an irregular plural. And so, yeah, he says his feet are cold, but I never modeled for him the word feet. I never said, "Are your feet cold?" And I highly doubt anyone else has. And so, if all language is learned from modeling or prompting, then how did he ever come up with feet? It's a question, and I don't have the answer to it. And that's kind of the same as like that second example of novel productions when they come up with these things they haven't heard before. And there are some words that we use all the time. This bottom limitation, for instance, the or a or is. But we don't always hear all those connecting words in speech, especially in early development. So again, my 2-year old, he probably doesn't form. He's starting to, but when he was starting to talk, even though I'm talking in full sentences to him, I would never say milk, mommy. I would never ask him to ask me that. I would say, can you say milk, please, mommy, or can I have some milk? And he would just say milk, and I gave it to him. So if he's hearing me say these other words that are so common all the time, then why didn't he use them sooner? So again, a lot of the limitation comes in this question of how they form grammar in this model. Um, we'll move on because I hope I haven't confused you more. Um, but just this concept that if it's about what they hear and imitating, then they should be producing the words we say the most first, and that's not typically what we see. So why is that? What's the gap in our knowledge about this model? However, there are significant contributions and implications. There is an essential role that a caregiver adults play in children's language learning. They need the exposure. Um, Another huge contribution of this radical theory at the time it was presented, and to some still radical theory, is that it inspired a lot of looking further, like alternative theories, like, well, that doesn't make sense. And so that spurred on other research, and that's always good. And then it's been a successful tool in the development of intervention approaches to enhance language skills for many different areas of categorical disability. And just to add to that, one thing that, even if it's not the language I was taught in, that I have noticed in my practice is the value of reinforcement and understanding behavior enough to know that behavior doesn't change without being reinforced. And so it doesn't always have to be a tangible reinforcement. I'm not saying they always need an M&M, but I have to find something that reinforces the child to where when they're using this language I'm teaching or a certain sound I'm teaching, that they're reinforced, because that's what's going to change the behavior. And so I think, if nothing else, that you can get from thinking about any kind of behavioral model, especially as we're focusing on language, it is critical that a child is reinforced when we're trying to teach anything, and that includes language.